The rain was falling heavily that night. Water trickled down the sidewalks as I watched the movement through the window, a glass of whiskey in my hand and my cell phone next to me, with ignored messages flashing on the screen. It wasn't just any night, but the anniversary of our wedding. For her, apparently, it was just another excuse to get out of the house. The party she was at wasn't the first, nor would it be the last. But this time, it wasn't with friends, it wasn't with work colleagues. I knew that. The perfume she wore when she left, the muffled laughter as she got ready, and that message I accidentally saw weeks ago all confirmed it. She had chosen to be with him, her lover, rather than with me. The heat of hatred and contempt boiled in my chest, but the disappointment was even greater. After all, I knew. I had always known. But, until then, I had remained blind. Out of fear. Out of hope. Out of love. It didn't matter anymore. I took the keys and got into the car, driving aimlessly while the thought hammered away in my head, she wouldn't be back in time. It was predictable. I'm going to be late, don't wait up for me. Empty words sent by text message, as if that were enough. My heart seemed to weigh tons as I drove. It wasn't just the betrayal that consumed me, but the feeling that I had been replaced, discarded, like an old object that no longer fit. I followed her. Yes, I followed her. I did something I never imagined I would do, but that night something inside me had changed. I was no longer a man resigned to the role of an ignored husband. I became someone willing to face what I had previously feared. I parked the car a safe distance away and watched. There she was, standing in the doorway of a house that wasn't ours, with laughs and hands that weren't mine. The dress I had complimented her on earlier shone under the lights of the entrance. The way she approached him, the way she touched his face, everything was a cruel contrast to the coldness with which she had been treating me lately. The silence in the car was broken only by the sound of my heart beating like a drum. "Are you all right?" asked a stranger as he passed my parked car. I could only shake my head, forcing a smile that disappeared as soon as he drove away. The anger I felt was replaced by something worse, emptiness. The certainty that I was no longer the protagonist in her life. I was an extra. I drove home, each kilometer of the journey seeming longer than the last. As soon as I entered, the smell of her perfume was still in the air, like a ghost reminding me of her presence. I went to our bedroom and, with a determination I didn't know I had, started emptying her drawers. I put all her clothes in suitcases. I took the photos off the wall, the ones that once symbolized a life built together. With each piece of clothing I threw into the suitcase, it was as if I was tearing a piece of that history. I loved her, but at that moment that love turned into something unrecognizable, a mixture of sadness, contempt and an almost uncontrollable desire to disappear. Hours later, she arrived. The door opened slowly and her footsteps echoed down the corridor. "Are you still awake?" she asked, her voice laden with a slight sense of surprise, perhaps guilt. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I waited for her to enter the room and see the suitcases. "What's this?" she asked, confused, her tone oscillating between indignation and nervousness. "That," I began, my voice calm despite the turmoil inside me, "is the end." She took a step back, as if she'd been hit. "What are you talking about?" "You chose," I continued, my voice rising just enough for her to realize the pain I was carrying. "You chose someone else. Then I chose for both of us. Your things are ready. Now you're free. Free to go to as many parties as you want, with whoever you want, because here, in this house, you don't live anymore." The shock on her face was evident. She tried to justify herself, stammering out excuses that sounded more like insults. "I didn't mean to hurt you, it was just one night, it doesn't mean anything." "It means nothing." I interrupted, my voice finally breaking. "You destroyed everything, and you want me to believe that it means nothing?" She remained silent. Perhaps she knew that any attempt at redemption would ring hollow. Finally, she shook her head and left, without looking back. I closed the door, leaning against it as I felt an inexplicable weight come down on me. This wasn't a victory. There was nothing to celebrate. I was alone, but I was also free. But that's not the end of the story. The betrayal she chose was not without consequences. Her lover, who seemed like the perfect escape, was about to turn out to be something much more dangerous. And I, even though I was determined to move on, would be dragged back into a game of lies and revelations. How will she cope with losing everything? How will I find the strength to rebuild my life? And, above all, what really happened that fateful night? The answers are closer than I think, and the consequences will be more devastating than any of us could have predicted. Welcome to our channel. Here, we do not support, condone or justify any kind of betrayal. All the stories are fictional and carry a clear message: betrayal is a choice that destroys lives, trust and families. Get ready for an intense story full of twists and turns. Sit back, take a deep breath and immerse yourself in a narrative that will stir your emotions. Good story. The first rays of sunlight came through the curtain in the living room, reflecting softly off the polished furniture and the carefully chosen carpet. The house was a reflection of Anthony and Sophie's life, meticulous, organized and, at first glance, impeccable. Anthony always said that the house was more than walls and a roof, it was a shared dream. Every detail, from the paintings on the wall to the solid wood dining table, bore the mark of decisions made together, moments of joy and, in some cases, long discussions that ended in laughter. Anthony was a methodical man, with an almost predictable routine. His days started early, with a run in the park before having the breakfast Sophie used to prepare. He loved the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of the radio on in the kitchen. His work as an engineer kept him busy, but he always found time for Sophie, even if it was just for a quick dinner or a lazy chat on the sofa. Anthony had a serenity that was both his greatest strength and his vulnerability. He trusted Sophie in a way that almost seemed unshakable. Sophie, on the other hand, was the opposite. Spontaneous, creative and full of energy, she worked as a freelance graphic designer, which allowed her flexible hours and a freedom that Anthony admired, but didn't always understand. She was passionate about art, and the walls of the house were full of her creations. Sophie had a charm that enchanted whoever was around, a smile that lit up the room and a unique ability to turn any trivial situation into something memorable. Their 8-year relationship was often described by friends as the perfect couple. Sophie and Anthony were the kind of couple that everyone saw as a model of stability and partnership. But within the walls of that house, there were silences that weren't always comfortable. Sophie, for all her vivacity, seemed to carry something that even Anthony couldn't name. He noticed the moments when she looked out of the window, lost in thought, but never asked. Perhaps for fear of knowing the answer. The last few months had brought subtle but noticeable changes. Sophie spent more time away from home, citing work commitments, and Anthony, in his characteristic confidence, rarely questioned. He believed that, in a healthy relationship, individual space was essential. But something inside him was beginning to worry, a feeling that things were no longer the same. However, he pushed these thoughts away, convincing himself that everything was fine. That particular morning, Sophie seemed more agitated than usual. Anthony noticed as she hurriedly put on her coat and grabbed her car keys. "Are you sure you don't want me to drive you?" he asked, frowning. "No, that's fine. I'll sort it out quickly and be back before lunch," Sophie replied, avoiding his gaze. Anthony smiled, a little awkwardly, as she hurried out, leaving only the sound of the door closing. As Anthony finished his coffee, he looked at his watch and tried to ignore the discomfort he felt. Perhaps it was just the accumulated stress. The demanding job, the little disagreements about planning a trip they'd been putting off for weeks. He sighed and decided to occupy himself with something productive. He went to the garage to organize some tools, trying to clear away the thoughts that insisted on coming back. Sophie, meanwhile, was driving down the road with the radio on, but barely paying attention to the music. Her mind was full of conflicting thoughts, emotions that she couldn't sort out. There was something inside her that was struggling to break free, but which she didn't know how to express. The sensation was both liberating and frightening. She bit her lower lip, a habit she'd had since childhood, whenever she was anxious. Anthony's phone vibrated on the kitchen table as he returned from the garage. A text message from Sophie. "Don't worry, I'll be back soon. Love you." He smiled as he read it, but there was something about the simplicity of that message that seemed forced. Sophie had always been more expressive, more detailed in her words. He shook his head, trying to dispel any paranoia. Throughout the day, Anthony devoted himself to household chores and small repairs that had been put off. He liked the feeling of fixing things, putting order into what seemed out of place. It was almost therapeutic. But even with his mind occupied, he couldn't stop a persistent question from echoing in his mind: why did he feel that something was wrong? When Sophie finally returned home, it was late. She walked in with a broad smile, carrying a bag of ingredients for dinner. "I thought we could cook together today," she said excitedly. Anthony smiled, relieved. "Sure, that would be great." As they prepared the meal, laughter filled the kitchen again, and for a moment, everything seemed the same. Sophie told stories of curious encounters with clients, while Anthony laughed and asked questions. But even in the moments of lightness, there was something in her eyes that seemed distant, as if a part of her was somewhere else. The evening ended with the two of them on the sofa, watching a movie that Anthony had chosen. Sophie fell asleep leaning against his shoulder, and he stayed there, watching her. She seemed so peaceful, so serene, that he was almost convinced that her restlessness was just a figment of her imagination. Still, as he looked at her, he couldn't ignore the feeling that he was missing something. Or perhaps he already had. The clock struck almost midnight and Anthony carried her into the bedroom. He laid her on the bed and covered her carefully. Before turning off the light, he stood still for a few moments, looking at Sophie, trying to understand what she was feeling. Something was different, but he couldn't say what. With a final sigh, he switched off the light and lay down next to her, trying to convince himself that everything would go back to normal. But deep down, he knew that when things change, they never go back to the way they were before. The air had seemed heavier over the last few days. Anthony, even immersed in his routine, was beginning to feel that something was slipping out of his hands, something he couldn't define. Morning still began with his usual run and the smell of coffee filling the kitchen, but Sophie seemed more distant. Small gestures, like the touch on his shoulder or the spontaneous smile, had diminished. She was still kind, but there was a reserve in her actions, something he sensed but didn't know how to address. One evening, while organizing papers in the home office, Anthony found a card he didn't recognize. It wasn't unusual to find things on Sophie's desktop, as she often left drafts or client materials around the house. But this card wasn't about design. It was a handwritten message: "I can't wait to see you again. You brighten my days." Anthony felt a tightness in his chest. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to organize his thoughts. The name at the end of the message was male, and the handwriting was firm, confident. He tried to push away the immediate thought that crossed his mind, but the discomfort remained. That same evening, Sophie arrived late again. When she came in, she had the same smile as always, but Anthony noticed something different. Her perfume was stronger, perhaps a new fragrance or an over-application. She spoke briefly about her day, claiming to have had an exhausting meeting with a demanding client. He tried to listen, but her words seemed distant. The card was still on his mind, and he didn't know how or if he should mention it. Instead, he limited himself to a nod and a restrained smile. The next few days were filled with little signs that Anthony couldn't ignore. Sophie seemed busier, her cell phone was always nearby, and she constantly checked messages while smiling discreetly. Anthony tried to ignore it, trying to convince himself that his mind was exaggerating. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. One afternoon, Sophie said she had to leave early for an important appointment. Anthony, though uncomfortable, just nodded, holding back the urge to ask questions. He watched through the window as she hurried off. His heart felt heavy as he contemplated the emptiness that remained in the house when she left. After almost an hour, restlessness overtook Anthony. He wasn't the impulsive type, but something inside him pushed him to act. He grabbed his keys and decided to follow Sophie, something he had never imagined doing. He drove through the streets carefully, keeping a safe distance from her car. Sophie parked in front of a cafe that Anthony didn't recognize. He stayed in the car, watching from afar as she got out and went inside. The minutes seemed like hours. Anthony was torn between confronting her right then and there or waiting to understand more. When Sophie finally got out, she wasn't alone. A tall, confident-looking man accompanied her. They chatted animatedly as they walked together to his car. Anthony felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. He followed them at a safe distance, watching as they entered a small, discreet restaurant. The scene seemed surreal. Anthony couldn't believe what he was seeing. He parked, keeping far enough away not to be noticed, but close enough to observe. Sophie and the man seemed close, exchanging laughs and looks that Anthony knew all too well. He stood there, caught between the desire to go in and confront them and the fear of what he might discover. The hours dragged by, and Anthony remained in the car, watching the restaurant until the lights began to fade. Sophie got out with the man, laughing and gesturing as if the world around them didn't exist. They walked to his car, and Anthony watched as she held his hand for a few seconds before getting in. It was at that moment that he felt the weight of the truth. It was real. What he had feared was happening right before his eyes. Anthony followed the car at a greater distance this time, his heart beating so hard that he could barely hear his own thoughts. He tried to stay calm, but anger and pain fought to take over. When the car finally pulled up in front of a house Anthony had never seen before, he stopped across the road. He watched as Sophie and the man walked in together, without hesitation, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. He sat there in the car, staring at the closing door, trying to process everything he had seen. The world seemed to have collapsed around him. The trust he had always had in Sophie, the certainty that they were different, that nothing could shake what they had built, all that seemed like a lie now. He felt an emptiness he had never experienced before, a sense of loss that was almost physical. As the clock struck midnight, Anthony was still in the same place, unable to move. He knew he needed to make a decision, but the pain and anger kept him stuck. When he finally started the car and drove home, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. The betrayal had been exposed, but the reasons and secrets behind it were yet to come. The weight of the truth was beginning to reveal itself, and Anthony felt that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The morning brought an eerie silence to the house. Anthony had been up all night, sitting on the sofa, staring at a fixed point on the wall while his mind wandered through a whirlwind of thoughts. Sophie's betrayal had exploded in front of him like a bomb, but what made him uneasy was the feeling that there was more to it. Something she was hiding, something that went beyond what he had witnessed. When Sophie came down the stairs, her eyes met his. There was a moment's hesitation, as if she could feel the weight of tension in the air. Anthony said nothing, he just pointed to the dining table, where two chairs were arranged facing each other. Without a word, she understood that it was time to talk. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "No," he replied, his voice low but firm. "Sit down." Sophie hesitated, but obeyed. Anthony's expression was indecipherable, a mixture of tiredness, pain and determination. The silence between them was almost unbearable, and Sophie was the first to break it. "What's going on, Anthony? You've been acting strange since yesterday." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I followed you, Sophie. I saw you with him." The words hung in the air for a moment, as if they needed time to be absorbed. Sophie stood still, her eyes wide, before looking away. I can explain, she began, but Anthony interrupted her. Explain? What exactly do you think you can explain? I saw you go into his house, Sophie. I saw enough. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, as if trying to pull herself together. It's not what you think. Anthony let out a bitter laugh. Then please enlighten me. Because the way I see it, you chose someone else. You lied, cheated, and destroyed everything we built together. I never wanted it to be like this, she said, her voice breaking. I love you, Anthony. I really do. Love? Is that what you call love? Anthony pounded the table, his patience wearing thin. Spare me the empty words, Sophie. She held her head with her hands, her eyes watering. You don't understand. It wasn't just a simple choice. It was more complicated than that. Anthony stared at her, his expression hardening. Then explain. Because so far, all I can see is the obvious choice you made, to betray me. Sophie seemed about to speak, but hesitated. It was as if the words were stuck, weighing down her tongue. Finally, she took a deep breath and began, her voice trembling. He's not just any man, Anthony. He was my first love. Anthony blinked, surprised, but didn't soften. And what does that mean? Did you decide that our story, our marriage, was less important because he reappeared? That's not it. Sophie shouted, her voice laced with emotion. When he came back, I thought I could ignore it. That it didn't mean anything. But there were feelings that I didn't even know still existed. Anthony shook his head in disbelief. And you decided to feed those feelings instead of being honest with me? I was lost, she admitted. But that doesn't justify what I did. I know that. It's not just about him. It's about something you need to know. He narrowed his eyes, his tone turning even colder. Then say it, Sophie. Just say it. She hesitated, her eyes fixed on the floor. When she finally spoke, the words came out in an almost inaudible whisper. He's the father of my child. The impact of the revelation hit Anthony like a punch in the gut. He stood motionless, trying to process what he had just heard. Your son, he repeated, as if he needed to confirm that he had understood correctly. Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face. Before I met you, I got pregnant. But I never told anyone. Not even to him. I thought it was the right thing to do. But now he knows. And, he wants to be part of his son's life. Anthony rose from his chair, unable to sit still as her words echoed in his mind. Are you telling me that, for all these years, you hid it? That there was a son? That there was a father you never mentioned? I was afraid, she shouted, her voice full of despair. I was afraid of losing you, of how it might affect us. He began to pace back and forth, trying to control the avalanche of emotions. And now? What did you expect to happen? That I'd just accept it? I don't know, she admitted, sobbing. I don't know what to do, Anthony. I just know that I love you, but I can't ignore what happened. Or what's happening now. Anthony stopped and stared at her, his gaze penetrating. And where does that leave us, Sophie? What's left for us after all this? She didn't answer. The silence that followed was deafening, each second seeming like an eternity. Anthony knew that this moment would change everything. The pieces were on the table, but he didn't know if there was any way of putting them back together. With one last look at Sophie, he said, his voice firmer than before. I need time. Time to understand what this means, for you, for me, and for this child you've hidden from me. But know one thing, Sophie, trust, once broken, is almost impossible to regain. He left the room, leaving Sophie alone with her thoughts and tears. At that moment, they both knew that the hardest battle was yet to come. Anthony left the house without looking back, feeling the weight of the revelation pressing down on his chest like an anchor. He needed air, space, something to get him out of the chaos that the dining room had become. He got into the car and drove aimlessly, the streets passing by like blurs as he tried to process Sophie's words. A son. A secret hidden for years. He gripped the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles turned white, while anger, pain and confusion took turns to dominate his thoughts. He parked in an empty lot, the gray sky reflecting his state of mind. Sitting there in the silence, everything seemed to fragment. For years, he had believed that he knew Sophie, that they shared everything. And now, he was discovering that she had carried such a monumental secret, something she hadn't even trusted him with. He wanted to scream, cry, punch something until his anger subsided, but all he did was lean his head against the steering wheel and take a deep breath. His cell phone vibrated. A message from Sophie, "Please come home. We need to talk." Anthony stared at the screen for a moment before turning it off. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Meanwhile, Sophie walked around the house like a shadow, unable to sit down, unable to do anything but revisit the moments that had led to this disaster. Anthony's expression, his voice laden with sorrow, echoed in her mind. She knew she had made a mistake. She knew she should have told him from the start. But the fear of losing him, of being judged, had always paralyzed her. Now, however, there was no escape. Everything was exposed. Hours later, when Anthony finally returned, the tension in the house was almost palpable. He entered, silently, with firm steps, but avoided looking at Sophie. She was sitting on the sofa, her eyes red from crying. When he walked straight into the kitchen, she stood up. "We need to talk," she said, her voice still broken. "You've said enough," he replied, reaching for a glass of water. His coldness was like a slap to Sophie, but she knew she deserved it. "Please, Anthony. I need you to understand." "Understand?" He put the glass down hard, turning to face her. "What exactly do you want me to understand, Sophie? That you decided to hide something so important from me for all these years? That you chose to betray me and then justify it? I never wanted to justify anything. I know I made a mistake, but it wasn't out of malice. Evil or not, Sophie, that doesn't change the fact that you lied. For years. About something that would have changed everything. I was afraid," she said, her voice shaking. "Afraid of how you would react, afraid of losing you." And over time, it got harder and harder to tell. Anthony laughed, but there was no humor in his tone. "Afraid of losing me? And now, what have you achieved with this secret?" She hesitated, feeling the weight of the truth. "I know it's late, but I want to make things right. I want you to know that, even with all this, my love for you is real." "Real?" He crossed his arms, his gaze icy. "And where was that love when you decided to seek comfort in the arms of another man? The same man who now wants to be part of the life of the son you hid from me?" The silence that followed was overwhelming. Sophie stared at the floor, unable to answer. Anthony sighed, rubbing his face as if trying to ward off the emotional exhaustion that was consuming him. "I don't know how to move on from this," he finally said, his voice lower. "I don't know if I can." Sophie took a step towards him, her expression full of pleading. "Please don't give up on us. We can get through this together. I know we can." He stared at her for a long moment, before shaking his head. "I need time. And you need to understand that what you've done isn't something you just get over." He left again, leaving Sophie alone in the room, embracing the silence. Over the next few days, Anthony remained distant. He stayed in a small hotel, far away from everything, trying to find some clarity. Sophie, for her part, tried to get in touch several times, but he ignored every attempt. He needed space, but above all, he needed to decide if there was anything to be saved. It was during one of these lonely nights that Anthony received an unexpected call. It was the man he had seen with Sophie, the father of her child. He wanted to meet Anthony, discuss what had happened and clarify his role in the situation. Anthony hesitated but, driven by anger and the need for answers, agreed. The meeting took place in a discreet café. The man, whose name Anthony now knew to be Victor, seemed calm, but there was a weight in his gaze. They sat down and Anthony got straight to the point. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I didn't come to cause trouble," replied Victor. "I just want to clarify a few things." Anthony crossed his arms, waiting. "I didn't know about the son," said Victor, his voice firm. "Sophie never told me. When I found out, it was a shock, but I decided I wanted to be part of his life." "And you thought the best way to do that was to have an affair with her," retorted Anthony, his anger evident. "I'm not going to lie," admitted Victor. "It was a mistake. A mistake that should never have happened. But I was confused, and Sophie was too. None of it was meant to hurt you." Anthony laughed in disbelief. "Well, congratulations. You did it anyway." Victor lowered his gaze, taking a deep breath. "I just want you to know that, despite everything, my intention is only to be a father to my son. I don't want to destroy what you and Sophie have." Anthony remained silent, processing Victor's words. He was still furious, but for the first time he began to realize that the situation was even more complicated than he had imagined. This didn't make things any easier, but it did open up a new perspective. When he returned home, he found Sophie waiting for him. This time, he was ready to talk, to put all his cards on the table. They both knew that this would be the decisive moment, when everything could change. The silence between Anthony and Sophie that night was almost tangible, as if every unspoken word hung in the air, weighing them down. He had come home, but the tension in the room made it seem as if he was still a long way off. Sophie was sitting on the sofa, her gaze fixed on her hands, while Anthony stood leaning against the dining room table, his arms crossed as if he were holding all the weight he was carrying on his chest. "I met Victor today," he said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was controlled, but there was an intensity in it that made Sophie look up immediately. It took her a moment to respond. "What did he say?" "That he didn't know about his son until recently. That he wants to be a part of his life. That your affair was a mistake." Anthony spat out the last word, as if it tasted bitter in his mouth. Sophie looked away, clearly struggling with the emotions it brought up. "He's right. It was a mistake, Anthony. A mistake that should never have happened. But it did." Anthony took a step towards her, the pain evident in his eyes. "What now, Sophie? How do you expect me to carry on after this?" She opened her mouth to reply, but closed it again, unable to find the words. After a moment, she took a deep breath and spoke with raw honesty. "I don't know. I don't know how to fix it. But I do know that I don't want to lose you." Anthony laughed softly, a bitter laugh. "Lose? Sophie, I've already lost myself in all this. I've lost trust in you, I've lost the sense of security I had in our marriage. And now, there's a child involved. How do you expect this to work?" Sophie stood up, her face marked by the tears that were starting to flow. "I just know that I love you. That, despite everything, I want to make things right. I want to be honest, even if it's too late. I don't want us to end up like this." He watched her for a moment, the intensity of his feelings almost unbearable. There was something about Sophie, about her vulnerability, that he wanted to believe. But the pain and hurt were too deep to simply erase. "Do you love?" he asked, his voice low but full of emotion. "Do you love, Sophie? Because that's not what love is. Love isn't lying for years. It's not cheating. It's not letting me find out everything in the worst possible way." She took a step towards him, hesitantly. "I know I made a mistake. And I understand that it can be impossible to forgive. But I can't give up on us without trying, Anthony. You're everything to me. And I just want us to have a chance to rebuild this. Anthony turned his face away, as if he needed a moment to breathe, to collect himself. He knew Sophie was being sincere at that moment, but the scars ran deep. The image of Victor, his words, the weight of the revelation, everything seemed to crush him. And deep down, he knew Sophie was right about one thing: there was a bigger dilemma at stake. Rebuild, he repeated, finally looking at her again. How? With Victor involved? With this secret that's turned into an avalanche? How am I supposed to trust you again, Sophie? She bit her lip, struggling to hold back the tears. I don't expect you to trust me now. I know it will take time, if at all possible. But I want you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Tell the whole truth, face the consequences, whatever it takes. Anthony sighed, running a hand through his hair. He felt caught between the desire to move on and the weight of the past that now dominated every corner of his life. There was a boy involved, a son Sophie had kept secret. How could he just ignore it? I don't know if I can, he said at last, his voice breaking. But I don't know if I can leave either. Sophie took another step, this time lightly touching his arm. He didn't pull away, but he didn't react either. We don't have to decide everything now, she said, almost in a whisper. But I want you to know that I'm here. And that I'm going to fight for you. For us. Anthony didn't reply immediately. He stood there, staring into her eyes, trying to find some clarity amidst the chaos. Finally, he took a step back, creating a space between them. I need time, he said firmly. To understand what I want. To find out if there's anything here worth saving. Sophie nodded, silently respecting his decision, even if the fear of losing him was still overwhelming. Anthony left again, but this time not to escape. He needed answers, but above all, he needed perspective. He drove for hours, until the sun began to rise. He stopped at a viewpoint, the cold morning wind blowing as he gazed at the horizon. It was there, in that solitary moment, that he began to ask himself what really mattered. The marriage he had, broken though it was. The promise of a future he didn't know if he could rebuild. Or the need to move on, to start again without carrying the weight of such a devastating betrayal. The moral dilemma he faced was more complex than anything he had ever experienced. Anthony knew he couldn't ignore the child. That boy was a part of Sophie, and, as much as it hurt, he knew it meant something. But what to do with Sophie? The love he felt for her still existed, but it was buried under layers of hurt and mistrust. Their future depended on more than words or promises. It depended on actions, on real change. When he returned home, he found Sophie in the same position, still on the sofa, as if she hadn't moved since he left. Her eyes were puffy, and she looked tired but determined. I've decided something, said Anthony, his voice firm. Sophie looked up, waiting for what would come next. Anthony took a deep breath before continuing. Sophie was sitting in front of him, her eyes locked on his as if desperately searching for a spark of hope. He moved closer to the window, watching the gray sky outside. When he began to speak, his voice was calm, but laden with a weight that seemed impossible to bear. I've thought a lot, he said, without turning to face her. About you, about us, and about everything that's happened. I can't just ignore what's been done, Sophie. You broke something inside me that I didn't even know could be broken. Sophie opened her mouth to reply, but he held up his hand, asking for silence. But I also realized something. The love I had for you was real, but it wasn't enough to prevent all this. And now, I'm tired of trying to be enough to sustain something that's always been falling apart. She closed her eyes, the tears sliding silently down her face. Anthony's words were like cuts, precise and deep, but she knew he was being honest. The silence between them seemed interminable until he finally turned to face her. I'm leaving, said Anthony. Not because I hate you or want to punish you. but because I need peace. I need to find myself again, away from all this pain. Anthony, please, Sophie began, but her voice failed her. She knew she had lost. He was firm, resolute. And for the first time, she realized that the weight of her choices had finally crushed what they had. He picked up a suitcase that was already prepared by the door. Sophie didn't know when he had packed it, but there it was, as a cruel symbol that he had already made up his mind before entering that room. You'll have to deal with Victor, said Anthony, his voice harsh but not cruel. With his son. That part of your life doesn't belong to me. Sophie nodded slowly, unable to argue. She felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Anthony opened the door and, with one last look at her, left. The sound of the door closing was like a final echo, closing a chapter she could never rewrite. In the months that followed, Sophie tried to rebuild her life. She and Victor established a cordial but distant relationship, focused mainly on the well-being of their son, who was now a more concrete part of their lives. Victor tried to get closer to Sophie, but she wanted nothing more than stability for the boy. She lived with the guilt of her choices, trying to find a purpose, but the void left by Anthony was constant. Anthony, on the other hand, found a new beginning. He moved to a small town, away from everything that reminded him of Sophie and the pain she carried. It was there, in a local cafe, that he met Clara. She owned the place, with a warm smile and an empathy that Anthony didn't know he needed. They started chatting, first as friends, but the connection between them grew naturally. Clara knew that Anthony carried scars, but she never pressured him. Instead, she offered patience and understanding. Months later, Anthony realized that he was beginning to feel something he thought he had lost forever, peace. Clara didn't fill the void that Sophie had left, but she helped Anthony realize that he could find happiness again, even after everything. They began to build something together, not hastily, but with the confidence that they were both ready to start again. Victor, for his part, faced his own journey. Becoming a father was not something he had planned, but he plunged into the new reality with determination. Despite the complex circumstances, he tried to be a constant presence in his son's life, something that Sophie reluctantly accepted at first, but eventually realized was essential. Her son, who had been the center of so much pain and revelation, was growing up surrounded by parents who, despite their mistakes, tried to give him the best. He would never fully understand the impact his existence had had on everyone's lives, but, in a way, it was a reminder that even from the most difficult situations something good could emerge. For Sophie, life continued with a constant weight. She knew she would never get Anthony back, and deep down she understood that perhaps that was fair. She devoted herself to her work and her son, trying to find some kind of redemption in the time she still had. But missing Anthony was a shadow that followed her, a reminder of what she had lost by not being honest. One cold winter's afternoon, while Sophie was walking with her son in a park, she saw a couple sitting on a bench, laughing and chatting. For a moment, she recognized Anthony and Clara. Her heart squeezed, but she didn't approach them. Instead, she stood there, at a distance, watching him smile, something she hadn't seen for a long time. At that moment, Sophie realized that maybe, just maybe, Anthony had found the peace she had never been able to offer. Anthony, sitting next to Clara, didn't see Sophie. He was focused on the moment, on the small joys he had learned to value. For the first time in a long time, he felt no anger, hurt or longing. Just a deep sense that, despite everything, he had found what really mattered, the freedom to be happy. If you liked this story, let us know what you thought. Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more intense and exciting stories. Remember, this channel does not support any kind of betrayal. See you next time.